my turn, isn't it? I get so lost in the music. Thank you, ladies. It was wonderful. And Rachel, did I hear that right? Oh, it's good having you here. And Robin, it's always nice seeing you up here. I feel like that you and Chase are a beautiful part of what we're becoming. And so we're so happy with it all. I hope all of you had a wonderful week like I did. Is that just absolute? Did you have a good week? Somebody back there is saying yes. Good. We're not like the guy. I heard the story, the elderly couple. That I want to laugh every time I say that word. But anyway, the guy's gone out to the mall. The lady's listening to the TV. And suddenly on the TV, there comes this thing about there's a car going the wrong way on the freeway. And so she decides that she's going to call her husband and have him to be careful. And so she gets him on the phone and says, "Hon," he said, "there's a car going the wrong way on the freeway." And he said, "One hell." He said, "They're all going the wrong way." I hate days like that. I wanted to talk about giving and receiving. Do you know, it's so different how that this progresses in your life. You know, like in fundamentalism, if you do a message like that, they call it meddling. About giving, that is. But it seems like there's a progression of understanding that I've gone through over the years, you know, of what giving is about. I know I started out and tithe, for example, and expressed some generosity, but besides tithing to the church, but it seemed like a duty then. And then I went through this stage to where I said, man, it's really a privilege. And then I've come to the stage to where it feels like I've unlocked one of the secrets of the universe. I don't know how that could be, but when I think of the mechanics of the universe, then I began to think, this is something so hard to explain how you come by. I think you have to experience it really to become aware of what it's like and what it really amounts to. Let me read a couple of scriptures to you. This is the words of Jesus during the Sermon on the Mount. It's from Luke, though, the version in Luke, 6th chapter. "Give, and it will be given to you. A good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over, will be poured out into your lap. For the measure you use, it will be measured to you." And now concerning, Charles Fillmore had in the Revealing Word these words about giving and receiving. "It is necessary to give freely if we are to receive freely. The law of receiving includes giving. The knowledge that substance," now this is that which out of which everything is made, but substance is omnipresent, and that man cannot therefore impoverish himself by giving, but rather will increase his supply and will enable man to give freely and cheerfully. And he quotes a scripture in Matthew. "Freely you received, freely give." What I've come to understand about generosity, now this is not just about money, but it is just generosity in general, is that somehow it's connected to a higher law. Do you know, we have all of these laws that are necessary for the physical world, but what I think that we don't always realize is that in spirit or in the world that we really are a part of, there are higher laws. And the higher laws don't always make sense to us when we're thinking about it in terms of just like mathematics, for example. How in mathematics could you say that if you take 10% out of 100%, you would say, well, that leaves 90%, but it needs more. Somehow, if it's in the right spirit of giving and in the right knowledge of that which is the spiritual world, well, then it multiplies. It has a sense of expanding or expansion, and which really wouldn't make any sense. But when you get to thinking about all of the laws that we have from the Bible or from the words of Jesus, they are all related to the spiritual world. For example, just after he said that by the measure you give, it's by that measure you will receive, the very next thing that he said in that next verse was, and you forgive and you will be forgiven. It's like there is another law. Now, some of the laws are very hard to understand. For example, he said, and this has to do with the same kind of spiritual law. He said, love your enemies. Well, everybody knows that you're supposed to bomb your enemies. Aren't you? No. No, you're not. But it's the culture that those who are living in just the physical world, and that's what they can see is the material world, and they can't see beyond that into a spiritual world. Well, you would never accept that. And loving those who hate you, that was the next sentence after love your enemies, love those who hate you. Give those that would take away from you, give it to them. And then give them some more, follow them down and give them something else. Now, none of that makes any sense if we're living just materially speaking. But there is a certain law of the spiritual world that says that generosity, if it's in a certain way and form, when I say that, I'm qualifying it a little bit, and here's the reason why, is because a person could say, well, now look, I need more money, so I'm going to give. Well, that's the wrong motivation. But somehow it works that way, but it's the wrong motivation. I think that when we start out and we begin to realize that we are really part of a spiritual world, I think then things like that begin at a certain level then to make more sense. But in that higher law, this is something from Romans, but sin shall not be your master, because you are not under the law, but under grace. Well, when you think about grace, what would be, does somebody have a quick answer for that? What would you say?
Grace is how God takes care of us that we don't have to earn.
That's right. Okay. In other words, it's an area of life. I've known people living out life, and it always, as I observed their life, seemed like they got more trouble out of what they did. And then I think about my own life, and I've always, it seems like, avoided maybe the consequences that I should have been. I think, well, that mistake could really be rewarded in a different way, and then it turns out that it's as though it didn't happen. And I think that there's an area there, and I don't know how to teach it really, because I don't. One day I said the only explanation I have is that God loves me a lot better than he does anybody else. It's the only thing I can think of. There doesn't seem to be. But there is such a thing as a way that we think in spirit. In other words, and we think of things. It's like in Pat's meditation, she mentions the presence of God, but then you have to acknowledge it. You have to be a part of that presence. And this seems difficult too when you say, but it's part of the spiritual world. You can see now where I end here physically. But if you had the eyes to see reality as God is reality, then you would see that there really is not much separating or nothing at all. You can't tell where I end and you begin. That's spiritual law. That is another way of looking at everything and another way of beginning to think, where you begin to think about things like, well, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And really, what you do, then you begin to say, do unto others because they are you. There's no separation. It appears in the material world that there's separation, but there's really not. We are all one. And sometimes it appears that we're separated from God, from that which is spiritual, because a series of things happen and we get to letting our minds go off in a different direction. But the truth is, separation does not exist. But you can create the feeling within you of separation, and then the physical results you get are as though it was reality. But it's not reality. Well, what we have to realize about giving and receiving, the very, very first thing that we have to get into our mind is that God is our source and our only source. And when we say it like that, it sounds like that we're talking about somebody remote, somebody out there that's making a decision. Can you hear me? Crawling. It has life of its own today. But it's as though we're talking about somebody out there that's making decisions on a day-to-day basis of what we will give old Glenn, you know. This isn't what's happening. The universe that's about us has an absolute underlying intelligence. When you get to looking at how things happen, and if that is God, I'm getting to that. That's coming up next. I'm not going to leave it out. Okay. The universe itself, and when we're thinking of that, we're thinking of the entire invisible world, is trying to give us everything that we need. This is what's trying to happen. I didn't see the documentary, but Pat was telling me about it. She saw a documentary, and it's concerning things that the astronauts have said as they get away and into outer space, and they look back and say, this place is such a gorgeous place. There's nothing as you look into the heavens that are anything like what we have here. And we think about, yes, but how much abuse and this, that, and the other. But the fact is that the earth itself is all providing the fruit. Everything we seem to have ever needed is right here waiting for us, because that's how things work. This is why that when we get to thinking about another law, a higher law, we have to immediately say there are no limitations in this higher law and living by this higher principle. That everything you need as you need it will show up. So then, if giving doesn't deplete supply, but rather enhance it and expand it, this means that we've uncovered a secret of the universe. Of somehow in the spiritual world, that being generous creates a different life pattern and a different life than we would be experiencing, say like we're hoarding, because hoarding or not giving or being stingy or however you'd like to classify it is actually denying that there's an abundance. And so when we're denying that there is abundance, This means we're taking our world and we're scrunching it down into a much smaller place. We're not seeing the bigger picture. We're not seeing infinite supply. I've always felt like that the tithe is the right thing. It just took so long in my life to see exactly what it does, because there's been times that we've not done this. That before I met Pat, somehow when the two of us got together, we had always in the past been tithers and been givers. That's a better way to say it. Tithe is like giving to the church. But keep in mind one thing about giving to the church. It isn't the church really that needs it. And God hasn't run out of anything, so it's not really. It's because of the transformation as we began to give, not only in money, but of our time, of our love, of the healing power that is within us, with all of this treasure of stuff that we've stored up inside of us. It's giving of all of it and discovering that it's not depleting, it's not getting less, but it keeps expanding and getting more in all of the ways that are hard to understand. All of this becomes part of it. But actually, generosity is the natural state of all of us. If we could let go of the fear, the sense of lack, if we let go of all of those things, it's actually the natural state of us. There was two employees discussing their employer. And one of them said, "Isn't he the most gracious, generous man that you've ever seen?" And the other guy said, "Well," he said, "if I had his money, I would be generous and gracious." And the other one said, "Well, he was that way before he had any money." So we have to see it like it is. But it's like opening up the door to God's good. This is what generosity is about. I have to tell a story about my grandmother. I think about her a lot to this day, even though she's been gone since I was 21 years old. But this is on my dad's side, paternal grandmother. And I can't really think about generosity without thinking about her. But she married, like back in the 1800s, and then had two sons. And when my dad, which was the second son, was 13 months old, her husband passed away. And so she was left. She had a farm and two little boys. And somehow she managed through all of it. And not only did she bring up the two boys, but a sister passed away that had 3 children, and she brought up those 3 girls, and all of them somehow managed with her help, and I don't know what else helped because that's been so far before my time, but they all got college educations. And then another sister who had illness, she got her daughter at 2 years old, and she became one of my closest relatives over the years because it was more like an aunt or even more. But my grandmother did so many things for so many people. And one son died in World War I, and there was a settlement, and she already had a farm, but there was a settlement, and then there was a little check that came, and this is like 1918 beginning, and then through the 20s, it didn't seem like very much money, but in the Depression, it seemed like more money. And so I went to live with her, or my family, we moved in with her. My dad fixed indoor plumbing for the first time it had been in that house. She had sold that farm that she grew up on, and then bought one in the edge of a town called De Leon, which is on just outside the city limit, barely to the city limits, and on the road from Dublin to De Leon. I don't know whether y'all have ever heard of Dublin or any of these places. Probably you have, if you lived in Texas very long. But here's this little old bitty lady, and she takes us all in because we're having a tough time in the Depression. And I'm like 2.5, 3 years old. And there's a limited amount of rooms, and so I had to sleep with my grandmother. And up until I was 6 years old, well, we shared a room. But we not only did that, but we were like best friends. She was considered a little childish, and which made her perfect for me because we were like buddies. But the unusual thing about her in this smaller farm on the edge of town, it was about 20 acres, I'm guessing. But we had chickens, we had a cow. But the garden was the most fabulous thing that you could imagine. And things like potatoes, I know we used to stack them under the house where it was on a hill, and under the part that was higher, and I was about the only one the right size to get under there to get them out. I know that when we had potatoes, well, they sent me, and I was the guy that brought the potatoes. But, and then, snuff. And so we would sit on the front porch in a swing, and so she fixed up me a little tin, and with some chocolate and some sugar in it, and then we had each of us a little limb of peach tree that she hammered out a little bit, and we would dip, and she would put the radio in the window, and we would listen to, I think it was Bewley's Chuck Wagon Gang singing things like "You Are My Sunshine," but it seemed like heaven. People were complaining about the depression, but I want to tell you, we had a garden that was next to none. I mean, it was huge. I don't remember who plowed it or kept it going, but I know that there was just plenty of everything. But she was always giving something away, and all of the excess things she would can. And there was even a grape arbor, and she would make that into, start to say wine. She was Primitive Baptist, and she would never use the word wine, even though it's in the Bible and Jesus okayed it, but it was grape juice. But with a little sugar in it and a couple of years of setting up, and she would dip her snuff, and whatever. But we would go and do things like during the day of gathering blackberries down on the fence line. They grew wild, but there were so many of them, blackberries. We had fruit trees, and there were plum trees, but there wasn't just one plum tree. There was a bunch of different kinds. They were all different kinds of plum trees that grew on that place. There were peach trees. I mean, the list just goes on and on. There was a persimmon tree. We never knew what to do with it. We chunked them at people at times. But we never really figured a way to eat. But there was something while I was there during that period of time, was the Depression, and the railroad track ran down on the road going into De Leon, and called back then, I don't know whether this is politically correct anymore to refer to somebody as a hobo, but they would come. The house, somebody said our house was marked because they knew my grandmother always had food cooking. There would be pinto beans soaking and others that had cooked, but then they would soak more. There was every day of our life, there was pinto beans. And there was potatoes usually and whatever else. There was squash. That was one of my favorite things. But then there was like chicken. We had a whole bunch of chickens and things. But the hobos would come up and she fixed them a meal. I mean, and it was always a meal for everybody. And the thing that's interesting about her check is that what she didn't use, she gave away. And at the end of the month, she was always broke again until that other check, the next check came in. Well, later, I would come back and spend summers there. When we moved away, another relative, one of the girls that she'd brought up, and her husband moved in. And she was always giving somebody a place to stay. And she wound up living the rest of her life with them, even though that she sold off her house, helped them buy a farm. But it was just this way, that nothing of materialism was important, because she knew how to sew things. She made quilts. She did all of these things that kept her busy. I can remember sitting with her, and This is besides sitting out dipping the snuff, but this is when we were in the house and put a towel over my lap and we would snap, is it beans or peas? Beans, snap, and listen to the radio to Maul Perkins and to Stella Dowell. That was part of our afternoon because she and I did everything together. Now, this has been sometimes it stays on there perfectly. But I've always think of her now, when I'm thinking back, and now I'm sort of into metaphysics, or really into metaphysics, I see her as sort of a special angel. Can you see a tiny little snuff-dipping angel? Isn't that just like God? But it taught me, like, the wonder of how in the world you could keep giving away and still always have more, and it just keeps expanding. Because now that I think back on this, she, without knowing it, I never heard her think of herself as generous. I never heard anybody else call her, well, maybe the girls that she brought up, but rarely ever did anybody make any big deal out of it. I know my mother really didn't much care for her because she was a little sassy, but just like angels are. But it sort of soaked into me. And then later, when I began studying spiritual things, I realized that without even knowing it, she was acting on a higher law. In her whole life, she didn't know any better. It was just, if she had it, she gave it away. But it's a fascinating study when you get to thinking about that part of it. It's not ever that the church or God needs. We need that experience of seeing it through to what it is, because it may not turn into something we can put our hands on immediately, and it may show up in different forms. But I will tell you this, that getting back to the natural state that we really are of being generous is one of the great things. And there's so many here that are such wonderful examples of how this has happened. And I bet you that everybody here has a story of what this is like and what this has meant to their personal life, because it is one of the very keys to the universe. Talking about the state of grace, we grow in this grace. And someone told me that it's a little bit like a little kid growing up, and that in the beginning, a swat on the behind corrects the problem, maybe. And then as a person grows up, they begin to sense the rights and the wrongs, how to keep out of trouble, how to keep out of the street, how to keep in the right mode to avoid consequences. Well, something about living in grace is the very greatest experience that we can have. This is where we want to think ourselves to and be a part of this, because it is part of our mindset as we begin to change how we see things and how we think about things and how we get away from some of the physical laws that seem to rule everything and get into a higher spiritual law that becomes an absolute blessing to us. Thank you. God bless you.
Waiting for Joe. In search of baskets, right, Joe?